Chapter 27. Mr. Armin had taught us in fencing class never to retreat from an opponent, for it is a defensive and not an offensive posture. He seemed to have forgotten his own advice. He was in almost constant retreat before Falconer's attack. I wanted to shout encouragement and instructions to him, as he had so often done to us. But even had my tight throat been able to form the words, I feared distracting him. So I watched in anxious silence. Falconer grew more confident as the duel went on, pressing his advantage, driving Mr. Armin backward first one step, then another. Mr. Armin warded the blows easily enough, but often failed to return them. Finally, he found an opening and delivered an edge blow that would have sorely wounded Falconer, except that he absorbed its force with the hem of his cloak. In the same instant, Falconer stepped forward and thrust at Mr. Armin's unprotected chest. Mr. Armin spun aside, but not quickly enough. The point pierced his doublet and passed along his ribs, making him gasp in pain and stumble back. Falconer withdrew and thrust again, meaning to catch Mr. Armin unprepared. But Mr. Armin was better prepared than he seemed. Instead of beating the blade aside, he performed a maneuver I had never before seen and have not seen since. In truth, I thought it was a blunder. He fell forward under Falconer's blade and landed on his outstretched left hand, at the same time thrusting his sword before him parallel to the ground. It took Falconer squarely in the belly and drove in halfway to the hilt. Falconer gave a gasp of surprise and drew back. His hood fell away from his face, revealing his startled and scowling countenance. The skin of his face looked tight and twisted, as though something were pulling it askew. He seized the blade of Mr. Armin's sword in his cloak-wrapped hand, and with a contemptuous gesture jerked it free and flung it aside. For a moment, it seemed as though he had not been wounded at all. It was a trick, I thought, a collapsible sword. I half expected him to laugh and come at Mr. Armin again. Then the blood began to well from the wound, spreading across his doublet, dyeing it red, and I realized with a shock that this was no illusion. This was not sheep's blood spurting from a bag, but his own life's blood draining away, and no amount of bandaging would staunch it. Yet we had to try. Though Mr. Armin was bleeding himself from the gash under his arm, he stripped off his doublet and his linen shirt. We knelt next to Falconer, who had sunk onto the stones of the street, and tried to wrap the cloth about him. He pushed it impatiently aside. "Let it be," he said, in a voice so unlike his usual growl that I blinked in surprise. "It's no use." Mr. Armin let the shirt drop and put an arm under Falconer's head as he sighed heavily and lay back. He seemed less like a man in pain than one who is simply, unutterably weary. His face was weary too. In full daylight, there was something curiously mask-like about his features. He pressed a hand to his face, as though trying to hide it from our view. But his words said the opposite. "I suppose you have a right to see the true face of the man you've slain." As I watched in astonishment, he plucked at the dark skin of his cheek with his fingernails and pulled away a great chunk of it. Where the repulsive scar had been, there was now a smooth, pale patch of skin. Again, his fingers dug at his face, and this time pulled away a portion of his hooked nose, leaving it straight and similarly pale-skinned. His eyes turned to me, and the look in them was almost amused. "You know me now?" I swallowed hard. "Aye, Mr. Bass." "And you?" he said to Mr. Armin. "But you knew before, did you not?" "I suspected it. Still, it was a good disguise, was it not? My masterpiece. Everyone's idea of what a Jew looks like, eh?" "An excellent disguise," Mr. Armin said. "Such a talent should not be wasted." "I agree. The very reason I left the Chamberlain's men. There were too many fools in it to suit me." Better a company of fools than the company of thieves. Mr. Bass coughed and wiped the corner of his mouth. A bit of red smeared the back of his hand. Perhaps so. But you must allow that I had the good taste to steal only from the best. Those were the last words he spoke, in this life at any rate. Though death had taken my fellow orphans and Dr. Bright's patients, I had never seen a man die at the hand of another, and had no notion of how I should react. I glanced at Mr. Armin as if for a cue. He avoided my gaze, and busied himself folding his doublet to prop up Mr. Bass's black-dyed head. I had not shed tears in a long time, nor did I shed them now. All the same, I was overcome with a strange sadness. At odds with the relief I had expected to feel, now that the threat which had hung over me for so long was removed. The sensation was something like what I'd felt for Julia, when she had been forced to relinquish her position as a player. I could give no name to it, unless perhaps it was the word Julia had once tried to acquaint me with: compassion. We sat with the dead man, ignoring the gawking crowd that had gathered, until a constable came and summoned a cart to bear the body away. The constable knew Mr. Armin, and when he was satisfied that the duel had arisen over stolen property, he let us go free. We both had had our fill of the Thames, and so walked back to the Globe by way of the bridge. "How is it you ken Mr. Bass?" I asked. "I might ask the same of you, but I'd rather you told your story to the company as a whole, and let them judge you. Will they? Will they turn me out, do you think? I can't speak for them. As for how I knew Simon Bass, the truth is, I was with his company a short while before I came here. They were a sorry lot. Not only did they steal scripts, they often borrowed the name and reputation of some respectable company. They would give a single performance, then depart in the dead of the night, often with the contents of the town's treasury. They seldom played the same town twice. There were scores of places where Bass dared not even go on legitimate business without disguising himself. But why bother to disguise himself from me? I suppose he didn't want to risk your giving him away. Or it may be he believed you'd follow orders better if they came from Falconer. I was right about that. I shook my head, still unable to quite understand. But how could a bear to play a part for so long a time and never reveal his true self? Perhaps, Mr. Armin said, it was his true self,